welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's disciples. The link is in the description below. Story number 1. I no longer have a gore fetish. By the Curator. Hey, everyone. I don't usually post stuff like this, but I feel like I have to get this out. Maybe it's a form of therapy. Maybe I just need to share it so I can try to understand it myself. I don't know. All I know is I haven't been the same since that day. I'm writing this because I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there will understand. Here goes. So, my name is Jack. I grew up in a pretty average suburban neighborhood in the Midwest. Life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. My parents were always fighting. They weren't physically abusive or anything, but the yelling and constant tension was enough to mess with my head. I guess you could say that's where it all started. I was a pretty weird kid. I didn't have many friends, except for Mike. Mike was my best friend since kindergarten. We did everything together. We were the outcasts, the weirdos, the ones who didn't fit in. I guess that's why we stuck together. We started getting into trouble around middle school. Nothing too serious at first, just some shoplifting and smoking weed. But it escalated from there. By the time we were 15, we were experimenting with harder drugs and spending a lot of time on the internet, especially the dark web. We were curious, and it gave us a sense of control, a way to escape our shitty lives. That's when I first got into gore. It started innocently enough, if you can call it that. Just watching videos of accidents and stuff. But it escalated quickly. I was drawn to the shock value, the raw reality of it. It made me feel something when everything else felt numb. Mike was more into the drugs. He didn't care much for the gore stuff. He thought it was weird, but didn't judge me for it. We both had our own ways of coping. Then one day, Mike went missing. We were hanging out in this abandoned building we used to go to, getting high and browsing the dark web on our laptops. It was a normal night, or so I thought. I went to take a piss, and when I came back, Mike was gone. Just like that. I called out for him, searched the whole building, but he was nowhere to be found. I was high and paranoid, so I didn't go to the cops. I figured he'd just gone home or something, but he never came back. After Mike disappeared, my life spiraled out of control. At first, I was in denial. I convinced myself he'd just taken off, that he'd show up again in a few days with some crazy story about where he'd been. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Eventually, I had to face the truth. Mike was gone, and he wasn't coming back. The cops weren't much help. They did a half-hearted investigation, but it was clear they didn't really care. Just another troubled kid gone missing. They figured he'd run away or overdosed somewhere. They didn't know Mike like I did. He wouldn't just leave without telling me. I felt guilty, like it was my fault. If I hadn't left him alone that night, maybe he'd still be here. Maybe I could have done something to stop it. I replayed that night over and over in my head, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. It was like this dark cloud hanging over me, always there, always reminding me of my failure. To cope, I threw myself deeper into the dark web. It was a way to escape, a way to feel something other than the guilt and the fear. I started spending hours every night browsing through the darkest corners of the internet. I watched gore videos, chatted with other messed up people, and did whatever I could to numb the pain. The gore videos became an obsession. They were a way to disconnect from reality. to feel something intense and immediate that had nothing to do with my real life. I started with the more mainstream stuff, accidents and fights, but it quickly escalated. I needed more, something stronger, something that would shock me out of my numbness. I started looking for the most extreme, the most brutal videos I could find. It was like a drug. The more I watched, the more I needed. I knew it was messed up. I knew it wasn't normal to get off on watching people get hurt, but it was the only thing that made me feel anything. It was like this dark part of me that I couldn't control, this hunger for the grotesque. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I couldn't. Who would understand? So, I kept it to myself, buried it deep down and hoped it would go away. But it didn't. It just got worse. I tried to fill the void in other ways, too. I started using more drugs, trying to chase that high, trying to escape the reality that my best friend was gone and I'd never know what happened to him. But the drugs only made it worse. They made me paranoid, made the dark web seem even darker. I started seeing things, hearing things. I was convinced someone was watching me, waiting to do to me what they'd done to Mike. My family didn't understand. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. I couldn't talk to them about it. They'd never get it. They'd never understand the dark hole I'd fallen into. I stopped going to school, stopped talking to anyone. I just stayed in my room, staring at my computer screen, watching video after video, trying to drown out the pain. One night, I had a complete breakdown. I was watching a particularly brutal video, and something in me just snapped. I started screaming, throwing things, trying to destroy my computer. I wanted it all to stop, wanted to get the images out of my head. My parents found me like that, and they didn't know what to do. They tried to help, but it was too late. I was too far gone. That's when they sent me to the psych ward for the first time. I spent a few weeks there, but it didn't help. I couldn't talk about what was really going on. Couldn't tell them about Mike or the dark web or the gore. They just gave me some meds and sent me home, thinking I'd be fine. But I wasn't. I went right back to the dark web, right back to the gore. I was trapped in this cycle of guilt and obsession, unable to break free. I knew it was destroying me, but I couldn't stop. It was like this dark force inside me, driving me to keep watching, to keep searching for the next video, the next high. It was the only way I knew how to cope with the pain, the only way I knew how to feel anything at all. That messed me up pretty bad. I tried to move on, but it was always in the back of my mind. I threw myself deeper into the dark web, looking for answers, looking for anything that could explain what happened to Mike. That's when I found it. The video that changed everything. It was on a site called example.onion. I had seen some messed up stuff before, but this was different. It started like any other gore video. Shaky camera, poor lighting. But then it panned out, and I saw them. 5 men, hanging by their wrists from the roof of what looked like a mechanic's workshop. They were naked and covered in blood, bruises, and cuts. They looked terrified. There was this guy. He looked like he was in charge. He was wearing a leather apron and a mask, like something out of a horror movie. He walked over to this machine in the corner and started it up. It was a sandblaster. I didn't realize what it was at first, but then he picked up the hose and pointed it at the first guy. The sound was deafening, this high-pitched whine as the sand hit the man's skin. He screamed, this blood-curdling scream that still haunts me. The sand tore through his flesh like it was nothing, leaving these gaping holes all over his body. Blood sprayed everywhere, mixing with the dust in the air. The guy in the mask didn't stop. He just kept going. moving from one man to the next, methodically, like he was doing a job. The screams, the blood, the sound of the sandblaster, it was all too much. But I couldn't look away. The second guy lasted longer than the first. He was younger, maybe in his 20s. He tried to twist away, but there was nowhere to go. The sand shredded his skin, peeling it away in layers. His screams turned to gurgles as the sand tore into his throat. By the time the guy with the mask moved on to the third man, the first two were barely recognizable. Just bloody, shredded corpses hanging from the ceiling. The third man was older, probably in his 40s. He didn't scream as much, just made these awful, guttural noises. His body jerked and spasmed as the sand hit him, opening up more wounds, spraying more blood. It was a nightmare, but I couldn't look away. I was transfixed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The fourth guy was a mess by the time the masked man got to him. He was already covered in blood from the others, and he was shaking so hard it looked like he might pass out. The masked man didn't care. He just aimed the sandblaster and went to work. The guy's skin peeled away like wet tissue paper. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. I thought he was dead, but then he started twitching again, like his body didn't know it was supposed to be dead. Then, it was the fifth man's turn. The camera zoomed in on his face, and that's when I saw it. It was Mike, my best friend, the one who had disappeared all those years ago. He looked different, older, thinner, but it was definitely him. I felt like I was going to be sick. My best friend, the guy I had grown up with, was hanging there, about to be torn apart by a sandblaster. The masked man didn't hesitate. He aimed the hose and started spraying. Mike screamed, and I lost it. I started yelling at the screen, begging them to stop, but it was no use. The sand tore into his skin, ripping him apart. His screams were the worst. They were filled with this raw, primal fear. I watched as his abdomen was torn open, his guts spilling out. He was still alive, still screaming, as the masked man moved the hose up his body, tearing through his chest, his neck, his face. By the time it was over, I was a mess. I was shaking, crying, unable to move. I had just watched my best friend die in the most horrific way imaginable. The video ended, and the screen went black. I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what I had just seen. That video ruined me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't get the images out of my head. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I couldn't function. I kept seeing Mike's face, hearing his screams. It was like he was haunting me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just a video, but I knew it was real. I knew what I had seen. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I checked myself into a psych ward. I told them I was having a breakdown, which wasn't far from the truth. I just couldn't handle it. The doctors tried to help, but nothing worked. The images, the sounds, they were always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need to get it out, to share it with someone who might understand. I don't know what happened to Mike, how he ended up in that video, but I know I'll never be the same. I used to be fascinated by gore, by the raw reality of it. Now, it just terrifies me. I can't watch anything violent without thinking about that video, without seeing Mike's face, hearing his screams. So yeah, that's my story. It's not a happy one, and I don't expect anyone to understand. But I had to tell someone. Maybe it'll help. Maybe it won't. But at least it's out there. Maybe now I can start to heal. Or maybe not. I don't know. I just know I can't go on like this forever. I spent a lot of time in the psych ward. They had me on all sorts of meds, trying to help me sleep, trying to calm me down. But nothing really worked. The doctors were nice enough, but they didn't understand. How could they? I couldn't even tell them the whole truth. How do you explain something like that? After a few months, they decided I was stable enough to leave. I didn't feel stable, but I guess they needed the bed for someone else. I went back to my apartment, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Everything reminded me of that night, of that video. I tried to get back to some kind of normal, but it was impossible. I couldn't go back to the dark web, couldn't even look at my computer without feeling sick. I started seeing a therapist, but it didn't help much. I couldn't talk about what really happened, so we just danced around the edges. I told her about my friend disappearing, about my fascination with gore, but I couldn't tell her about the video. I couldn't relive it, couldn't bring those images back to the surface. After that, I tried to stay away from the dark web, but it wasn't easy. The addiction was still there, lurking in the background, waiting to pull me back in. But I couldn't do it. Every time I thought about going back, I saw Mike's face, heard his screams. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the thing that used to bring me comfort now brought only terror. I started having nightmares, vivid and horrifying. I'd see Mike hanging there, his body torn apart, his eyes begging for help. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the images still fresh in my mind. I tried everything to make them stop. Therapy, medication, even meditation, but nothing worked. The nightmares were always there, a constant reminder of what I'd seen. My therapist said it was PTSD, that I needed to confront my trauma, but I couldn't. I couldn't talk about it, couldn't relive it. The one time I tried, I had a full-blown panic attack. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like I was back there, watching Mike die all over again. I started avoiding anything that could trigger the memories. No more horror movies, no more violent video games. Even seeing blood in real life was enough to send me into a tailspin. I became a recluse, barely leaving my apartment, barely functioning. My family tried to help, but they didn't understand. How could they? They didn't know what I'd seen, what I'd been through. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in this endless loop of fear and guilt. I couldn't escape it, couldn't find a way to move on. The more I tried to forget, the more the memories haunted me. It was like Mike was always there, always watching, always screaming. That's when I decided to check myself into the psych ward for the second time. I knew I needed help, real help. I couldn't keep going like this. The doctors there tried their best, but it was clear they didn't know how to handle what I was going through. They put me on stronger meds, tried different therapies, but nothing seemed to work. The nightmares, the flashbacks, they were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag me back into the darkness. Leaving the psych ward this time was different. I felt more lost than ever, more disconnected from reality. I knew I had to find a way to cope, to deal with the trauma. Writing this post is part of that. Maybe sharing my story, getting it all out, will help me start to heal. Maybe it'll help someone else out there who's going through something similar. I still think about Mike every day. I wonder what happened to him in those years he was missing, how he ended up in that video. I'll never know, and that's something I have to live with. But I can't let it destroy me. I can't let it control my life. I've started trying to rebuild, to find some semblance of normalcy. It's not easy, and some days are better than others. But I'm trying. I'm taking it one day at a time, one step at a time. I know I'll never be the same, but maybe I can find a way to live with the memories, to make peace with them. Thanks for listening. Getting this off my chest has been soothing for the soul. Story number 2. How I Got Myself Killed on the Dark Web, by the Curator. My name's Alex. I guess you could say I'm your average college student. Or at least I was before all this happened. I'm studying computer science at a small state university, juggling classes and a part-time job at a local coffee shop. Life wasn't bad, but it was predictable and monotonous. That's where my weekend rituals came in. I needed an escape from the grind, a way to blow off steam and forget about the endless assignments and demanding customers. Every Friday night, after the last class of the week, I'd come back to my tiny apartment, exhausted but relieved that the weekend had finally arrived. I'd throw my backpack on the couch, kick off my shoes, and fire up my laptop. My escape was waiting for me on the dark web. I'd open a browser, go to the Tor network, and navigate to my usual vendor's page. This vendor, who went by the name Dealer X, had a solid reputation. He always had the best stuff, and his reviews were consistently stellar. LSD, ecstasy, some other pills that I never bothered asking too much about. All I knew was they got me where I needed to be. A couple of clicks, send some Bitcoin, and within a few days, I'd have my weekend escape delivered right to my mailbox. It was risky, sure, but the thrill of it all added to the appeal. This one Friday was no different. I got home, made my order, and 2 days later, a small, unmarked package was waiting for me. The anticipation was killing me. I was pretty excited about this batch, because Dealerx had some new stuff. I was supposed to meet up with some friends that night, but plans fell through, so I figured I'd have a solo trip. No big deal, I thought. I'd done it plenty of times before. I sat down in my living room with a glass of scotch, feeling the familiar buzz of anticipation. I opened the package and laid out the pills on my coffee table. There were 3 of them, each a different color. A small note inside the package caught my eye. Take in order. Trust the process. Enjoy the ride. Dealer X. I downed the first pill with a swig of scotch, feeling the burn as it went down. It wasn't long before I started feeling a bit lightheaded, so I reclined on my couch, letting the effects take over. I remember the room spinning slightly, the ceiling light above me blurring into a soft halo. I must have blacked out pretty quick, because the next thing I remember is waking up in what felt like a nightmare. When I came to, I was groggy and my head was pounding. I tried to move, but realized I was in some kind of glass cage. The walls were reflective, like mirrors, so I couldn't see out. I could only see my own disoriented reflection staring back at me. Panic started to set in. What the hell was going on? I banged on the glass, shouted, but there was no response. Just me and my echo. The glass cage was about the size of a small room. The floor was cold and hard beneath me. I looked around, trying to find any sign of where I was or how I got here. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. Then, a voice crackled over an intercom I hadn't noticed before. It was calm, almost soothing in a creepy way. Thank you for participating in our upcoming experiments. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. What? I shouted back. I didn't agree to anything. The voice continued, ignoring my outburst. We will be examining the effects of extreme psychedelic drugs. If you complete the protocol, you will be released. My heart was racing. I never signed up for this. It was supposed to be a chill weekend, not some twisted science project. I kept shouting, demanding answers, but the voice didn't respond. I was trapped, with no idea what was going to happen next. After what felt like an eternity, a small compartment in the glass wall slid open, revealing a blue pill. The voice instructed me to take it. Hesitantly, I reached for it. It was the same color as the first one I took back in my apartment. With no other options, I swallowed it dry. Almost immediately, a wave of panic washed over me. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I started hyperventilating, clutching at my shirt, trying to calm down, but it was useless. The feeling was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if my entire world was collapsing in on itself. I could hear my pulse in my ears, my vision blurred, and I was sure I was going to die right there. My thoughts raced uncontrollably, spiraling into dark, terrifying places. I thought about my family, my friends, the life I might never get to live. It was like being trapped in a nightmare with no escape. My skin felt like it was on fire, and I scratched at it until it was raw and bleeding. I could feel my mind breaking, the panic consuming me. I wanted it to stop, but there was nothing I could do. Minutes felt like hours. The feeling was unbearable. I was on the verge of a complete mental breakdown when, as suddenly as it started, it began to fade. My breathing slowed, my heart rate returned to normal, and the overwhelming sense of panic receded. The voice came back, congratulating me on completing the first phase. I was left trembling, drenched in sweat, my mind a shattered mess. I didn't know how much more I could take. The next pill was a green one. I didn't want to take it, but what choice did I have? The voice had promised release if I made it through. I popped it into my mouth, my hands shaking. This time, the effects were slower, creeping in like a fog. The walls of the cage seemed to shimmer, and then they started to change. The mirrors dissolved, revealing dark, twisted shapes beyond. I saw figures moving, shadows dancing. They weren't human. They had elongated limbs, faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. Their skin was a sickly gray, their eyes hollow and empty. They started whispering, their voices like nails on a chalkboard. They were speaking to me, telling me things about my past, my fears, my deepest regrets. It was like they knew everything about me. I tried to shut them out, cover my ears, but it was no use. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a cacophony of horror. They taunted me with my failures, my mistakes, the things I wished I could forget. I saw my reflection again, but it wasn't me. It was a distorted version, eyes sunken, mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to me. The whispers turned into screams, and I felt like I was falling into a bottomless pit. The hallucinations became more intense, more vivid. The figures reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy. I could feel their touch, like ice on my skin. They pulled at me, dragging me into their world of darkness and despair. I fought against them, but it was like fighting against a tidal wave. I was being swallowed whole by my own mind. After what felt like an eternity, the horrors subsided. I was left trembling, drenched in sweat. The voice returned, cold and emotionless. You have done well. There is one final phase. The last pill was red. I knew this one was going to be the worst. My mind was already frayed, and I didn't think I could handle more. But again, I had no choice. I took it, my throat dry and scratchy. Almost immediately, I felt something crawling under my skin. I looked down and saw tiny bumps moving along my arms, my legs, my chest. It felt like bugs were crawling inside me. I started scratching, trying to get them out, but it only made it worse. The itching turned to burning, and I was tearing at my skin, desperate for relief. The bugs were everywhere now, moving faster, spreading. I could see them wriggling under my skin, and it drove me insane. I bit my lips, trying to hold back the screams, but I couldn't take it. I bit down on my wrist, trying to stop the crawling, but I ended up tearing my flesh open. Blood poured out, but I didn't care. I needed to get them out. I kept biting, ripping at my arms until the pain was too much. I was losing so much blood, and the room was starting to spin. I collapsed on the floor of the cage, feeling the life draining out of me. My vision blurred, the edges darkening. My body felt cold, and I could barely keep my eyes open. As I lay there, fading, I thought about everything. How stupid I'd been, how I'd ended up here because of my own choices. The pain was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the regret. The last thing I remember is the taste of blood in my mouth and the cold, creeping numbness spreading through my body. My heartbeat slowed and my breaths became shallow. I could feel myself slipping away, like sinking into a dark, endless void. And then, nothing. Just darkness. Story number 3. My Stepdad is a Snuff Lord. By the Curator. Hey everyone. I've been reading a lot of these creepy stories on here and decided to share my own. This happened about a year ago, and it still haunts me every single day. I'll try to write it all out as best as I can, but bear with me if it's not perfect. I just hope getting it out there will help me somehow. I'm a 21-year-old architecture student, and I live with my mom and my stepdad in a nice house in a small town in the US. I won't say which one for obvious reasons. My stepdad, let's call him Tom, is bipolar and has major mood swings. One minute he's the nicest guy, buying my mom expensive presents and treating her like a queen, and the next minute he's yelling at me for no reason. I've put up with him because he makes my mom happy, and she deserves that after everything she's been through. So, it was a regular Thursday afternoon, and I was working on a model project for my architecture class. I needed a box cutter to cut some cardboard pieces, and I remembered we had one in the basement storage. Our basement is creepy and cluttered with old stuff, but I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get my project done. When I went down to the basement, I noticed this weird noise, like a low hum or something. I thought it was just the old appliances acting up, so I ignored it and grabbed the box cutter. I went back upstairs and finished my project, but the noise kept bothering me. It was like a buzzing in the back of my head that I couldn't shake off. After I was done with my project, I went back to the basement to return the box cutter. This time, I couldn't ignore the noise. It was louder, and it felt like it was coming from behind one of the walls. I started to look around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the shelves seemed out of place, like it was covering something. I pushed the shelf aside, and to my shock, there was a hidden door behind it. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with all sorts of thoughts. Why was there a hidden door in our basement? What was behind it? I took a deep breath and opened the door. The noise got louder, and I realized it was coming from inside this makeshift room. Inside the room, it was dark and musty. There were restraints attached to the walls and a laptop on a small table. The laptop was on, and there was a shelf with about 100 DVD videos. One of them was playing, and I could see what was on the screen. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. It was a snuff movie. People being tortured and killed. I felt sick to my stomach and had to cover my mouth to stop myself from screaming. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I started to panic, but I knew I had to stay calm and figure out what to do. I looked at the laptop and saw a .onion link on the desktop. I clicked on it, and it took me to a dark web marketplace where people were paying to subscribe to this sick content. I was shaking all over. I couldn't believe my stepdad was involved in something like this. I grabbed a few of the DVDs and ran back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know where to go. My mom wasn't home, and I didn't know when she'd be back. I couldn't leave her alone with him. I ran upstairs, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I felt a surge of relief and terror all at once. 911, what's your emergency? I found something horrible in my basement. My stepdad, he's making snuff films. There are videos, and there's a room with restraints and everything. Please, you need to come quickly, I blurted out, my voice shaky and desperate. The operator's voice remained calm, which helped me a little. Okay, miss. Stay calm. Can you give me your address? I gave her our address, trying to keep my voice steady. She assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I could hear my heart beating in my ears as I watched the clock, every second feeling like an eternity. While I waited, I paced around the living room, trying to think of anything else I could do. I decided to call my mom and warn her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message, telling her to come home as soon as she could and that we needed to talk. I didn't want to scare her over the phone, but I knew I had to say something. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling into our driveway. I ran out to meet them, tears streaming down my face. The officers were professional and reassuring as they took my statement and followed me into the house. They asked me to show them the basement, and I led them down, my hands still shaking. The sight of the hidden room seemed even more sinister, with the officers' serious expressions confirming the gravity of the situation. They quickly assessed the scene and called for backup, treating it like the crime scene it was. One officer stayed with me, asking me more questions about how I discovered the room and what I had seen on the DVDs. I answered as best as I could, my mind racing with a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. As the police continued their investigation in the basement, one of the officers suggested I wait outside. I stepped onto the porch, the cool evening air doing little to calm my nerves. My thoughts were all over the place, but I knew one thing for certain. Tom had to be stopped. I heard the rumble of a car engine, and my stomach dropped when I saw Tom's car pulling into the driveway. The officers immediately tensed, their hands moving to their holsters as they prepared to confront him. Tom got out of the car, looking confused and then angry as he saw the police. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice already rising. The lead officer stepped forward. "Tom, you're under arrest for multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, and murder. We have evidence of your involvement in producing and distributing snuff films." For a moment, Tom seemed stunned, but then his expression twisted into a mask of rage. He started yelling, his face turning red. "You little bitch!" he screamed at me. "You've ruined everything. You think you're safe. I'll find you, and when I do, you'll wish you were never born." The officers moved quickly, restraining him and leading him to one of the police cars. His threats and curses filled the air, each word slicing through me like a knife. I could see the hatred in his eyes, and it terrified me. But seeing him handcuffed and taken away also brought a sense of relief. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. In the days that followed, our house was swarmed with investigators. They combed through every inch of the basement, gathering evidence and piecing together the extent of Tom's crimes. It turned out that he had been doing this for years, and there were many victims. The revelation rocked our community, and our house became a media circus. My mom was devastated. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved and trusted was capable of such horrors. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs, even though there was no way she could have known. We both started going to counseling to try to process everything that had happened. It helped, but it didn't erase the pain or the fear. I still have nightmares about what I saw. I can't walk past the basement door without feeling a chill run down my spine. I've thought about moving out, but I can't leave my mom alone. We need each other now more than ever. The trial was grueling. I had to testify about what I found, reliving the horror in front of a courtroom full of people. Tom's defense tried to discredit me, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Seeing him led away in shackles was a small comfort, but it didn't take away the fear that still lingered. Despite everything, I'm trying to move forward with my life. I'm still studying architecture, though it's hard to focus sometimes. I've become more vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, always locking every door and window. The fear is a constant companion, but I refuse to let it control me. Sharing my story here is part of my healing process. I hope that by telling what happened, I can help someone else who might be in a similar situation. If you ever find something that seems off, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to seek help. It could save your life, or someone else's. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.